Good morning. Thank you for joining us. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada is here today to provide its comments on the final safety investigation report into the downing of Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752. Our spokespeople are Kathy Fox, TSB Chair, Natasha Van Temsch, Director of Investigations, Air, who will be our French spokesperson, and Ewan Tasker, Manager of International Operations and Major Investigations, AIR, and TSB's appointed expert to the Iran investigation. Bonjour. Merci de vous joindre à nous ce matin. Le Bureau de la sécurité du transport du Canada est ici aujourd'hui pour formuler ses commentaires concernant le rapport final d'enquête sur le vol 752 de Ukraine International Airlines. Nos porte-paroles sont Kathy Fox, présidente du BST, Natasha Van Temsch, directrice des enquêtes du secteur aérien, Ewan Tasker, gestionnaire des opérations internationales et enquêtes majeures du secteur aérien et expert désigné du BST dans le cadre de l'enquête iranienne. We will be delivering remarks in English, followed by French. We will then be taking questions from the room and via teleconference. Les commentaires seront formulés d'abord en anglais, puis en français. Nous répondrons ensuite aux questions posées soit dans la salle ou par téléconférence. Madame Fox.
Good morning. On January 8, 2020, Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was shot down shortly after taking off from Tehran's international airport, killing all 176 people on board, including 55 Canadians, 30 permanent residents, and dozens of others with ties to Canada. Within a few short hours following this tragedy, the TSB advised Iran's Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, or AAIB, that we would appoint an expert in accordance with Annex 13 to the Convention on International Civil Aviation, and we accepted Iran's invitation to visit the accident site. From that day forward, we have been fully engaged in doing as much as possible to find out what happened, why it happened, and what needs to change to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Now, as a matter of practice, the TSB does not comment on reports from other agencies. However, given this unprecedented situation, where the state whose military was implicated in the event led the investigation, and given its impact within Canada, we feel that it is important to publicly convey our independent assessment of the final report. But before I discuss the contents of Iran's final investigation report, I'll speak briefly about the investigation process itself. First, I'd like to remind everyone that a safety investigation is not intended to attribute blame or determine civil or criminal liability. There are other processes that are better suited for that. Experience has shown that an independent and thorough safety-focused investigation usually offers the best chance of finding out what really happened and why, providing the answers that everyone is asking for, especially the families who lost so much. ICAO, Annex 13, prescribes the roles of participating countries, including which state has the right to lead the investigation and which other states may participate and to what extent. It should be noted that in the case of PS 752, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada had no jurisdiction to lead or conduct a parallel investigation. From the very beginning, Iran offered the TSB more access to the investigation activities than we were technically entitled to, but less than what we asked for. For example, 2 TSB investigators spent 6 days in Tehran following the crash, visiting the accident site, examining the wreckage, and meeting with Iranian safety investigators to review information gathered by their team. Later, they also met with Iranian, Ukrainian, and French investigators in Kiev before returning to Canada. In July of last year, our expert and a TSB recorder specialist attended the readout of the aircraft's flight recorders in Paris. Throughout the course of the investigation, we were in direct contact with Iran's AAIB and attended many discussions with the other participating countries. However, in spite of multiple requests, we were never formally accorded the higher status of accredited representative, and hence were not allowed to listen to the cockpit voice recorder or directly access the flight data recordings. At Ukraine's request in early February of this year, we were invited to provide them technical assistance, and Ukraine gave us access to the draft safety report for review and comments, something we would not otherwise have been entitled to. Throughout this process, we have specifically asked Iran's AAIB to answer three important questions. First, what was the sequence of events, including the technical, human, and organizational factors that led to the missiles being fired and the ultimate downing of PS-752? Second, what was the basis for the decision to keep Iran's airspace open during a period of heightened military alert after Iran had launched missiles into Iraq? And finally, why did civilian airlines continue to operate in Iran's airspace in the hours following Iran's launch of missiles into Iraq? In addition, we submitted dozens more detailed questions related to these three main lines of inquiry that we believe the final investigation report needed to address in order for it to be seen as thorough and credible. Since receiving Iran's draft investigation report, our team has carefully reviewed and analyzed its contents and has now compared it to the final report. And today we want to share our perspective, discussing how the report answers the three main questions. Iran's final report concludes that PS-752 was shot down because an air defense unit mistook the Boeing 737 as a threat. This misidentification reportedly occurred because of a misalignment of the missile launcher's radar. Furthermore, the operator did not receive permission to shoot from senior officers, as he should have. But to date, Iran has provided no evidence to support this scenario. However, it is a plausible explanation of what happened. The report does not provide detailed information regarding how the misalignment occurred, nor what steps were taken to ensure it was properly calibrated, nor anything about the missile operator's training, experience, or proficiency, nor about how or why the required communications with Central Military Command were either not followed or not successful. The report frames this action in the context of the heightened military alert, given their expectation of retaliation following Iran's earlier launch of missiles against Iraqi air bases housing U.S. military personnel. But it does not discuss what supervision or oversight was provided of field operations by Iran's military command and control. The AAIB says that military activities fall outside the scope of an Annex 13 investigation. We do not agree. Nor does the report discuss what steps the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has taken since then to identify the underlying safety deficiencies that allowed such an error to occur, nor what safety action has been taken to prevent such a mistake from happening again. Without this, how can the international civil aviation community be reassured that such a tragic error won't happen again? Iran's final report generally explains the risk assessment process and mitigations that its civilian authorities took in coordination with the military, given the uncertainty of a retaliatory strike following their launch of missiles into Iraq. For example, the report says that Iran gradually cleared air traffic from using certain air routes to the west, from which direction they thought a retaliatory strike might come, and required military approval for each individual aircraft's departure from civil airports such as Tehran's International Airport, including PS-752. However, Iran did not completely close its airspace to civilian aircraft. In spite of being in a state of heightened military alert, Iran did not publish any notices to warn aircraft operators of these hazards, as recommended by ICAO, until after PS 752 was shot down. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration did post a warning. However, this notice would not have been readily available to Ukraine International Airlines, nor other foreign operators outside of the U.S. Furthermore, Ukraine International Airlines was not the only airline to continue operating after Iran launched missiles against Iraq. In fact, 8 other aircraft departed Tehran before the shootdown of PS 752. The report only partially explains why the airspace remained open and why operators continued to fly after Iran had launched missiles into Iraq. It does not explain any of the underlying factors behind why the missiles were launched at PS 752, which is the stated cause of this accident. In short, the report says what happened, but it doesn't answer the why. The report indicates that some unspecified safety actions have since been taken by the military to reduce the risk of this happening again. However, the lack of details means we can't confirm that these actions will actually reduce the risks to civil aviation operations within Iran's airspace. Furthermore, although the AAIB has issued some recommendations, these don't specifically address the stated cause of this tragic event, which is the launching of the missiles. Now, we know this has been a very difficult time for the families, and in the end, no safety investigation report can bring back the lives of those who were lost. And so we must look at what has been learned and what can be done in the future to reduce the risk so that other families don't have to suffer through the same experience. We know that states will continue to engage in hostilities with other states or within their state. And in such a hostile environment, there will always be a risk to civilian aircraft, and innocent lives can be lost. It is the responsibility of the state to reduce these risks. So the best way to reduce the risk of such tragedies in the future is to firmly apply the lessons learned, first from the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, and now from this tragedy. More needs to be done to protect international civil aviation from operating in conflict zones. In a follow-up report to its investigation into the 2014 downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine, the Dutch Safety Board warned us, and I quote, "Practice shows that states in which there's an ongoing armed conflict will not implement restrictions for their airspace on their own initiative." Now, while ICAO has taken some action, it wasn't enough to prevent this occurrence. Transport Canada is now leading an initiative called Safer Skies to improve the safety of air travel worldwide by addressing gaps in the way the civil aviation sector deals with conflict zones. Such initiatives offer the best hope for the future to avoid another PS 752. In closing, I know much concern has been expressed about the international protocols that govern the conduct of these very unique types of safety investigations involving military activities, specifically the issue of the state of occurrence investigating itself. Additionally, when a state's accident investigation agency is not independent of the state aviation authority as required by ICAO, such as Iran's AIB, it can affect the credibility of the final report findings and the uptake of the resulting recommendations intended to prevent future accidents. Now that this safety investigation has concluded and Iran has issued its report, the TSB is committed to advocating for a review of the provisions of ICAO Annex 13 to improve the credibility and the transparency of such future safety investigations so that families and the public can have greater confidence in their findings and their recommendations. Thank you.
We will now deliver remarks in French before moving to the question period. La période de questions suivra l'allocution en français. Madame Van Temge.
Le 8 janvier 2020, le vol 752 de Ukraine International Airlines a été abattu peu après son décollage de l'aéroport international de Téhéran, causant la mort des 176 personnes à bord, dont 55 Canadiens, 30 résidents permanents et des dizaines d'autres personnes ayant des liens avec le Canada. Quelques heures après cette tragédie, le BST a avisé le Bureau d'enquête sur les accidents d'aéronefs de l'Iran, ou le AAIB, qu'il nommerait un expert au terme de l'annexe 13 à la Convention relative à l'aviation civile internationale. Et s'est pleinement engagé à faire tout ce qui est en son pouvoir pour découvrir ce qui s'est passé et pourquoi. Le BST n'a pas coutume de commenter les rapports d'autres organismes. Toutefois, il s'agit d'une situation inédite. Avant d'aborder le contenu du rapport d'enquête final de l'Iran, permettez-moi de parler brièvement du processus d'enquête lui-même. J'aimerais d'abord rappeler à tous qu'une enquête sur la sécurité n'a pas pour but d'attribuer de blâme ou de déterminer les responsabilités civiles ou pénales. L'annexe 13 de l'OACI régit les rôles des pays participants et stipule, entre autres, quel État a le droit de mener l'enquête, et stipule également quels autres États peuvent participer à l'enquête et dans quelle mesure. Il convient de noter que dans le cas de l'enquête sur le vol PS 752, le BST n'avait aucune autorité pour mener une enquête parallèle. Tout au long de ce processus, nous avons demandé expressément à l'AAIB de répondre à 3 questions importantes. Premièrement, quelle était la chronologie des événements, notamment quels étaient les facteurs techniques, humains et organisationnels qui ont mené au lancement des missiles qui ont abattu le vol PS 752. Ensuite, sur quelle base a-t-on pris la décision de laisser l'espace aérien iranien ouvert pendant une période d'alerte militaire après que l'Iran eut lancé ses missiles vers l'Irak? Et finalement, pourquoi les transporteurs aériens civils ont-ils poursuivi leurs activités dans l'espace aérien iranien au cours des heures qui ont suivi le lancement des missiles vers l'Irak? Également, nous avons présenté, en rapport à ces 3 champs d'enquête principaux, des dizaines de questions plus détaillées que le rapport d'enquête final devait aborder, selon nous, pour être perçu comme étant un rapport minutieux et crédible. Depuis que le BST a reçu l'ébauche du rapport d'enquête, notre équipe a soigneusement étudié et analysé son contenu et l'a maintenant comparé avec le contenu du rapport final. Aujourd'hui, nous voulons présenter notre point de vue sur la façon dont le rapport répond aux 3 questions principales. Le rapport final de l'Iran conclut que le vol PS 752 a été abattu parce qu'une unité de défense aérienne a pris l'avion pour une menace. Cette erreur aurait été causée par un mauvais alignement du radar du lance-missile. De plus, l'opérateur n'avait pas reçu des officiers supérieurs l'autorisation de tirer comme il l'aurait dû. Jusqu'à maintenant, l'Iran n'a produit aucune preuve pour appuyer ce scénario. Il s'agit toutefois d'une explication plausible de ce qui s'est produit. Le rapport ne fournit pas d'informations détaillées sur la façon dont le mauvais alignement s'est produit et les mesures prises pour s'assurer qu'il est convenablement calibré. Sur la formation, l'expérience et la compétence de l'opérateur du lance-missile, ou sur les raisons ou les manières dont les communications requises avec le commandement central n'ont pas été respectées ou n'ont pas été effectuées. Le rapport présente cette action dans le contexte d'un état d'alerte militaire accru, mais n'aborde pas la question de la supervision des opérations sur le terrain. Le AAIB dit que les activités militaires n'entrent pas dans la portée d'une enquête en vertu de l'annexe 13, mais nous ne sommes pas d'accord. Le rapport n'aborde pas non plus les mesures prises par le corps des gardiens de la révolution islamique depuis l'événement pour cerner les lacunes de sécurité sous-jacentes qui ont engendré une telle erreur, ni les mesures de sécurité qui ont été prises pour empêcher qu'une telle erreur se reproduise. Sans cette information, comment le milieu de l'aviation civile internationale peut-il être assuré qu'une erreur aussi tragique ne puisse se reproduire? Le rapport final de l'Iran explique en termes généraux le processus d'évaluation du risque et les mesures d'atténuation des risques prises par ces autorités civiles en coordination avec les autorités militaires. Par exemple, le rapport mentionne que l'Iran a graduellement empêché le trafic aérien d'emprunter certaines routes aériennes vers l'ouest, croyant que c'est de cette direction qu'une frappe des représailles viendrait. Toutefois, l'Iran n'a pas complètement fermé son espace aérien aux aéronefs civils. Même si elle se trouvait dans un état d'alerte militaire accru, l'Iran n'a pas publié d'avis pour mettre en garde les exploitants aériens contre ces dangers, comme le recommande l'OACI, avant que le vol PS 752 soit abattu. La Federal Aviation Administration des États-Unis avait, elle, publié un avis. Toutefois, cet avis n'était pas facilement accessible pour Ukraine International Airlines ou par d'autres exploitants étrangers hors des États-Unis. Par ailleurs, Ukraine International Airlines n'était pas le seul transporteur aérien à poursuivre ses activités après que l'Iran eut lancé des missiles vers l'Irak. 8 autres vols ont quitté Téhéran après que le vol PS-752 soit abattu. Ce rapport n'explique qu'en partie pourquoi l'espace aérien est resté ouvert et pourquoi les exploitants ont poursuivi leurs activités après que l'Iran eut lancé des missiles vers l'Irak. Il n'explique aucun des facteurs sous-jacents à l'origine du lancement des missiles vers le vol PS-752, la cause déclarée de cette tragédie. En bref, le rapport indique ce qui s'est produit, mais n'explique pas pourquoi cet événement s'est produit. Nous savons que ça a été très difficile à vivre pour les familles. En fin de compte, aucun rapport d'enquête sur la sécurité ne pourra jamais rendre les vies perdues. Nous devons donc compter sur ce que nous avons appris et sur ce que nous pouvons faire pour réduire les risques, afin que d'autres familles n'aient à souffrir, afin qu'aucune autre famille n'ait à souffrir de la sorte dans l'avenir. Il y a plus à faire pour prévenir les activités de l'aviation civile internationale dans les zones de conflit. Transport Canada dirige actuellement une initiative sur la sécurité aérienne, l'initiative pour des ciels plus sûrs, visant à améliorer la sécurité du transport aérien dans le monde entier en comblant les lacunes dans la manière dont le secteur de l'aviation civile traite les zones de conflit. Les initiatives de ce type constituent notre meilleur espoir pour éviter un autre PS-752. En terminant, je sais que de nombreuses préoccupations ont été soulevées en ce qui concerne les protocoles internationaux qui régissent l'exécution de ces enquêtes très particulières touchant des activités militaires, en particulier le fait que l'État d'occurrence mène une enquête sur lui-même. En outre, lorsque l'organisme d'enquête sur les accidents d'un État n'est pas indépendant de l'Autorité nationale de l'aviation civile, conformément aux exigences de l'OACI, et comme c'est le cas pour le EAIB, ceci peut nuire à la crédibilité des constatations du rapport final et à l'adoption des recommandations qui s'en découlent. Maintenant que cette enquête sur la sécurité est terminée, le BST est résolu à faire la promotion d'un examen des dispositions de l'annexe 13 de l'OACI en vue d'améliorer la crédibilité et la transparence des futures enquêtes de sécurité de ce type, afin que les familles touchées et le public puissent avoir confiance en leurs constatations et en leurs recommandations. Merci.
We will now start the question period. Please ask one question and one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant débuter la période de questions. Veuillez poser une question et une question de suivi. Please identify yourself before asking your question. Veuillez vous identifier avant de poser votre question. Operator, could we have a first question on the phone, please?
Thank you. Merci. If you have a question and you're using a speakerphone, please lift your handset before making your selection. Si vous utilisez un téléphone main libre, s'il vous plaît, soulevez le combiné avant d'effectuer votre sélection. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your device's keypad. Si vous désirez poser une question, mais s'il vous plaît, appuyez sur les touches étoile 1 de votre appareil. The first question is from Ashley Burke from CBC News. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, Chair Fox. Thanks for taking my question. Ukraine's foreign minister said yesterday in a video, he called this report, quote, a cynical attempt to hide true causes of the downing, and said it was nothing but a collection of manipulations aimed at not establishing truth, but acquitting Iran. In your own words, how would you describe this report?
We believe that the final report issued by Iran yesterday is incomplete. It raises more questions than it answers. It does provide some basic information about the factors that led to the military shootdown of PS-752, but it falls short of answering many of the detailed questions of the underlying factors that cause that. It briefly describes the risk assessment process, but it doesn't really go into the details about why, for example, they allowed aircraft to continue operating even though there was a threat of a retaliatory strike. and it doesn't really go into the details about why the aircraft was, or why it didn't issue NOTAMs until after PS752 was shot down. So overall, we believe it does provide some information, but definitely it leaves more questions unanswered.
And I understand the TSB had a technical advisor work with Ukraine and saw this draft report. Ukraine said that they submitted 90 pages of remarks and proposals, but it wasn't actioned. I'm curious if, obviously, I'm assuming that would have also included Canada's input as well. And I'm also just curious what your feelings are after 15 months. Your team's been searching for answers. What it feels like to get this report that you say is incomplete.
I'm going to ask Mr. Tasker to address that question because he was our appointed expert who, until now, we have not publicly identified, and he can give you a more direct answer. So,
thanks. So, in the process of the draft review advising the Ukraine accredited representative, we submitted our comments to them, which were then included with Ukraine's comments within that 90-page amount. We submitted approximately 120 questions. Or concerns of our own. Some of those were addressed in the report and some were not. As per Annex 13, for the submissions that are not addressed, the AIB that is running the report or doing the report has to either make the changes or pen the comments in the end. So you'll see in the appendices of this final report, there are many comments listed as from the Ukraine that have been penned with an explanation. Ours are included in that list as well. From approximately 57 onwards, there's approximately 48, I believe, of our comments that are left unanswered. And even reviewing further, looking back at the, say, 60 or so that are not penned, some of those as well we're concerned with don't seem to have amendments or changes reflected to them. So we did have many questions, and unfortunately many of them left unanswered.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Marie-Hélène Rattel à Radio-Canada. À vous.
Oui, bonjour. Je vous demanderais de résumer ça un peu en français. Dans un premier temps, comment est-ce que vous avez reçu ce rapport? Qu'est-ce qui était le plus frustrant et décevant pour vous là-dedans?
Donc, OK, pour ce qui est de ce que M. Tasker a mentionné au niveau des commentaires qu'on a donnés, on a été nommé comme, à la demande de l'Ukraine, comme conseiller pour l'Ukraine, conseiller technique. Fait que ça nous a permis, en fait, de reviser l'ébauche du rapport et de soumettre tous nos commentaires et questions qu'on avait au sujet de son contenu. Ça a été fait, puis ça a été envoyé à l'Ukraine, qui ont fait une soumission au AIB iranien. De toutes les questions et commentaires qu'on a soumis, il y en a certaines qui ont été adressées, mais pas l'ensemble de ce qu'on a demandé. Puis le processus, en fait, c'est quand ça, c'est pas fait, l'équipe d'enquête, l'autorité d'enquête doit attacher en annexe les commentaires qui n'ont pas été adressés. Puis vous allez voir dans le rapport final, en fait, c'est l'annexe B. Vous allez voir tous les commentaires qui n'ont pas été adressés dans le rapport sont listés à cet endroit-là. Pour ce qui est du commentaire général sur le rapport, comme Mme Fox a mentionné, le rapport, pour nous, est incomplet. Ce rapport-là, il soulève beaucoup plus de questions qu'il apporte de réponses, malheureusement. Fait que c'est ça, c'est incomplet. Puis malheureusement, le rapport se focus beaucoup sur qu'est-ce qui s'est passé, mais n'explique pas bien pourquoi ça s'est passé. Puis en fait, c'est le pourquoi qui est vraiment clé dans la prévention, dans les mesures qui doivent être prises pour prévenir un accident comme ça dans le futur.
Quels sont vos recours pour la suite des choses? Parce que je comprends que vous êtes très limité dans ce que vous pouvez faire, mais pour les familles des victimes, pour le gouvernement aussi, c'est pas suffisant. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a d'autres recours pour avoir un petit peu plus de réponses aux questions?
Oui, je vais répondre. C'est sûr que maintenant que l'enquête de sécurité est terminée, Nous, en tant que BST, on ne peut pas faire d'autre chose autre que, comme on a mentionné, on va poursuivre les changements au niveau des protocoles internationaux, au niveau de l'OACI. Par contre, on sait que le gouvernement du Canada a dit même hier, à travers d'un énoncé de la part des ministres des Affaires étrangères et des ministres de Transport, qu'ils vont quand même poursuivre. Maintenant, les recours qu'ils ont, je ne peux pas prononcer, c'est vraiment à eux de se prononcer, mais je pense bien qu'ils sont engagés fortement à essayer de trouver des réponses par d'autres moyens dans les jours, les semaines et les mois qui viennent.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Kevin Gallagher, CTV News. Your line is open.
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Fox. I just want you to elaborate a bit more on your difference of opinion of the type of investigation that you could launch in terms of Iran's military. Obviously, there's a lack of cooperation, it seems, a lack of evidence, you say, is provided. Is there any precedent? You said that there's a difference of opinion in how deep that investigation could go into, a country's military in a situation like this. Is there any precedent like this before? Was this totally unprecedented to try and get that type of information from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? And also, the evidence, obviously, that you say isn't provided. Could that have been provided easily in another context?
When we, the TSB, launched an investigation into an occurrence, everything is on the table. Nothing is out of scope. We pursue different lines of inquiry until we determine that they weren't a factor, and then we may stop. We believe that this investigation needed to look into the military activities that led to their stated cause, which was a misalignment, a misidentification, a miscommunication, a breakdown in procedures to support that scenario, which they haven't done. I acknowledge that it would be very challenging for any state to investigate its own military activities in such a case. But I think it's important for public confidence in the findings of the report to delve into those areas so that there can be confidence that if it was in fact an error, it won't happen again. Now, there have been previous shoot downs. There was a shoot down of Korean Airlines back in the early 80s over Russia. There was the shoot down of an Iranian airliner by the U.S. By a U.S. aircraft carrier in the late 80s, and those were investigated, and those reports are probably available online. So we don't accept the premise that you can't delve into the military side to identify what happened. And Iran has the best forum, we think, would have been through the safety investigation. Now, they haven't done that, so it remains to be seen what other information they will provide in the future, or what other recourses nations have to try and obtain that information, obtain the accountability and the justice that the countries and the families are seeking and deserve.
As a follow-up, was there clear evidence from the Iranian military of trying to obfuscate, trying to, shelter investigators from, a certain path of questions or investigations? Was there clear rejection, for example, of specific documents that TSB investigators felt would have been valuable to the investigation?
Well, like Kathy mentioned, when the TSB investigates, everything is on the table. So we will continue going down any road we think may lead to some sort of safety benefit or some lesson learned. In the case of Iran, it was clear early on in this investigation that they didn't intend to go too deep down into the military side of the investigation. And so although I didn't see evidence of obscuration or individual investigators being held back, it's the environment they're operating in. So once they've made that decision to not include the military in the scope, then that becomes a team decision, and then the whole investigating body does not go down there. And so whether you call that obscuration or whether you call that a limiting of scope due to their lack of independence is a question. But I saw no direct evidence of any sort of malfeasance or obscuration.
We will now take a question in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre une question dans la salle.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for taking our question. My name is Man Hamidi. I'm with the Canadian Press. Can you explain why military activities would be captured by ICAO rules and what these activities might tell us about what happened on January 8th?
Right, so it may seem to some that military activities would be outside of an Annex 13 investigation, but I can show you where they aren't. So in a case like this, Iran's own report says that the threat, the reason the airspace was kept open was that the threat was unknown or a previously understood or unknown threat of the possible mistake or incorrect launching of a surface missile. Now, in the future, for civil aviation bodies such as the regulator or the operator to do their risk assessments and make decisions based on these threats, they have to understand the threat. Because if they don't understand the threat, they can't make an accurate risk assessment to address it. So airspaces will remain open and operators will continue to fly if they don't understand that threat. So although it seems on the periphery, understanding the underlying factors behind it need to be understood to truly understand the threat.
Thank you. As a follow-up, you say the lack of detail in the report means that TSB can't confirm these actions will reduce risks to airlines in Iran's airspace. What should Canadians and airlines operating in Iran take from this? Is it like don't fly to Iran or something else?
What we're saying is not that there weren't actions taken, but the report says with respect to the military activities, the military has taken action to address the risk, but we don't know what actions they've taken. And therefore, how can the public, how can the civil aviation, international civil aviation community have confidence that whatever led to this particular shoot down won't happen again? And that's why we believe it would have been beneficial, not just to answer to the families what happened, but also to reassure the public and the international aviation community that action has been taken and the risks have been reduced. They have made some recommendations with respect, for example, to earlier publication of notices to airmen, with respect to oversight of risk assessments, but without knowing what happened on the military side and what actions they've taken, I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered.
Like people need to know, should they fly to Iran or not? Is it safe? Do you think like they should be hesitant to fly there because there is no enough safety procedures?
We're not in a position to say because we don't know what actions have been taken. So I think the important thing is that Transport Canada now is working with the international community through its Safer Skies initiative to learn from this accident, from this tragedy, and from others, what additional steps the international community has to take to ensure that civil aircraft aren't exposed to risk if they're operating in hostile areas, and that there's a broader sharing of intelligence information regarding emerging risks so that airlines are in a better position to make their own risk assessment, regardless of what a particular state decides to do.
We will now go back to the phone. Nous allons maintenant retourner au téléphone. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Alison Lampert from Reuters. Your line is open.
Thank you. We understand Canada is doing some type of forensic report or investigation. Do you know what this is about? Is TSB part of it? And how much information could Canada get, given, as you mentioned, the country is not accredited like U.S. Ukraine under Annex 13?
I'm sorry that, Alison, you were breaking up there. So I only understood part of your question. I don't know if you can repeat it again, please.
Sure. So we understand Canada is doing some type of forensic report or investigation. What does that involve? Have you heard of this? Is the TSB a part of it? And how much information could Canada get, given, as you mentioned, that Canada is not accredited like the U.S. or Ukraine under Annex 13?
Okay, thank you. Yes, we're aware that there is a forensic team that is conducting its own investigation. We're not part of that team. In fact, we did not share any information during the ongoing investigation with them or with anybody else because we were restricted from doing so under ICAO Annex 13. I believe that they intend to complete their investigation and release a report in the near future, but really you would have to ask the other government departments that are involved as to that particular investigation.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, you talked in your opening remarks about reviewing provisions of ICAO's Annex 13. So would you want the Annex, some of the provisions changed so that countries could not lead investigations if their militaries were involved, sort of like a model like what happened in MH17? Or what would you want to see changed?
The Annex 13 protocols have worked very, very well over many, many years in terms of multinational cooperation in foreign aviation investigations in your more typical type of aircraft accident, one caused by human error, mechanical error, weather, etc. But I think this most recent event and investigation demonstrates that it has limitations. Now, it's very clear under ICAO, under the ICAO Convention, that states have sovereignty over their airspace and over the conduct of investigations. So what we would like to see is are changes to Annex 13 that would facilitate more transparency and independence in the case, these unique cases where a state's military has been involved in bringing down a civilian airliner. And that might take many forms. It could be, for example, delegation, which is what Ukraine did in 2014 when an aircraft was shot down while transiting their airspace, and they delegated to the Dutch Safety Board, who produced a very thorough investigation report. It could be having independent observers, third-party observers as part of it. It could take many forms, but our belief is that the experts at ICAO should talk about this and look at, what have we learned from this and other investigations, and what can be done to improve Annex 13, specifically so that it fulfills its purpose, which is to get to the underlying factors so that actions can be taken, concrete actions, to prevent future accidents. Now, I will add that Ewan Tasker is the Canadian representative to the Accident Investigation Group at ICAO, and so we will be pursuing, hopefully, those types of discussions with our international colleagues in the coming weeks and months.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question. Éric Pierre Champagne, La Presse. À vous.
Oui, bonjour. En fait, ce que je comprends, je ne veux pas vous mettre des mots dans la bouche, mais ce que vous dites, l'analyse que vous faites du rapport de l'Iran, c'est que dans une situation similaire, si ça se produisait à nouveau, il n'y a rien qui garantit qu'on ne se retrouverait pas avec le même résultat, là. Puisqu'on comme vous dites, là, on sait ce qui s'est passé, le rapport nous dit ce qui s'est passé, mais on ne semble pas avoir pointé là, les éléments qui permettent d'expliquer pourquoi ça s'est passé, puis ensuite d'apporter les correctifs. Est-ce que c'est pas un peu ça? Il n'y a pas un risque dans des circonstances similaires, un incident similaire se reproduise à nouveau?
C'est difficile à dire parce qu'en fait, ce que le rapport omet de faire, c'est de donner les détails. Ils disent, par exemple, au niveau militaire, ils vont dire que des actions ont été prises, mais ils nous indiquent pas exactement quelles sont ces actions-là. Fait que c'est dur de pouvoir commenter sur un événement futur, est-ce que ça pourrait se reproduire, étant donné qu'on n'a pas ces détails-là. Puis c'est ça qui est malheureux dans cette enquête-là, c'est que ces détails-là sont importants, pas seulement pour l'Iran, mais aussi pour la communauté internationale. Si on veut apprendre de ces erreurs-là, ça nous prend les détails. Puis à défaut d'avoir les détails, bien, on n'est pas en mesure, justement, de faire une prévention aussi bonne.
OK, parfait. Je vous remercie.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Jason Magder, Montreal Gazette. The line is open.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my question. The families issued a statement yesterday, basically casting many of the same questions you were casting today, but it seems that they're also saying that it seems to have been a intentional military action. Is there anything that the investigator saw, anything that the independent investigator saw on our side, on the Canadian side, to support this? Is there any evidence that you have seen that was troubling that was not included in the final report?
So that's a difficult question. The final report, as you know, as we've mentioned, in the area of the explanation behind why the missile was launched is very thin. We're provided with a few explanations to do with the miscalibration, some miscommunication, lack of procedure, misidentification. But the underlying factors behind each of those, the why behind each of those, is left unexplained or unknown. So we don't have a lot of information. Being part of the investigation process, I also wasn't given any of that information at any point. So I haven't seen anything that's missing, but I realize there are many things beneath the surface that aren't in the report and unfortunately weren't shared with me.
Okay, and the Transportation Safety Board, as well as the families, have been asking for audio, the audio of the cockpit recordings, as well as other pieces of evidence that were not included in the final report. Is there any way to pressure Iran? Are there any avenues that can be taken to get this information actually realized, either through the ICAO or through any other international bodies to shed more light on this?
At the tail end of that question, your audio died down. Can you perhaps repeat the part after getting access to the cockpit voice recorder?
Sorry, is there any way to get to pressure Iran to get access to the voice recording, either through any international bodies? Essentially, is there any way to? Are there any? What's the next step that can be done once now it's concluded that the report still has many questions that remain?
Right. So there are many different rules and restrictions with cockpit voice recorders. Some of those laid out by ICAO Annex 13, and then some different in each country. For example, Canada is very protective of cockpit voice recordings. We will not release them. That may be different in other countries. In the case for us, in this investigation, because we were not accredited representatives, we were not allowed to hear the cockpit voice recording. The other accredited representatives were, unfortunately. Not unfortunately, that's fortunate for them, I should say. It's unfortunate that we did not get to. In terms of next of kin associations or others getting access to that cockpit voice recording in the future, it's a bit out of our scope, or not our scope, but the TSB's or role, I should say, in the sense that we're playing within that safety investigation rules, our own rules, the protection of that CVR and Annex 13. So there's no direct way really for us to push to get to it. Whether there is or not from a judicial perspective or some sort of other perspective, I think is a question better for those organizations. Was that the tail end of the question? I seem to remember something else at the end. Can you remind me?
No, that was basically it was what the next steps could be to try to pressure for these recordings to be released, essentially.
I will just add, again, in terms of our participation in the safety investigation, because Iran has issued its final report, our role essentially ends there. However, we do have, and we will pursue proposed changes to ICAO Annex 13. But again, I think the government of Canada has made it very clear that even if this report has been issued and the safety investigation is concluded, that doesn't end the quest for answers. And in fact, the government has perhaps other options, other recourses that it's considering, but it's really up to those departments to speak to that. We can't speak to that at this time.
Thank you.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, André Ducharme, TVA Nouvelle. À vous.
Oui, bonjour. J'aimerais que vous reveniez en français sur le fait que l'enquête est incomplète parce qu'on ne parle pas du tout du rôle des gardiens de la Révolution. Est-ce que vous pouvez élaborer là-dessus, s'il vous plaît?
Oui, c'est ça. L'enquête est incomplète parce que justement, qu'est-ce qui est écrit à ce niveau-là, au niveau de tout ce qui s'est passé du moment que les missiles se sont lancés, tout ce qui s'est passé dans l'arrière-plan du côté militaire, ils le mentionnent, ils disent qu'est-ce qui est arrivé, mais ils ne disent pas, par exemple, pourquoi que c'est arrivé. Puis c'est là qu'on trouve, c'est pour ça qu'on trouve que le rapport est incomplet. Comme par exemple, je vais vous donner certains exemples. On a l'impression souvent que le côté militaire, bon, on ne peut pas parler de ça, c'est secret, mais il y a certaines choses qu'on peut, qu'on devrait, même sous l'auspice d'une annexe, d'une enquête de l'annexe 13, on devrait être en mesure d'avoir ces réponses-là. Comme par exemple, si on regarde juste au niveau de l'opérateur, c'était quoi la formation de cet opérateur-là, son expérience, ses compétences. Ensuite de ça, pourquoi que les communications n'ont pas fonctionné avec les supérieurs de cet opérateur-là? Fait qu'il n'a pas été en mesure de communiquer avec personne. Tout ce genre de détails-là devrait faire partie du rapport parce que c'est ça qui va nous permettre de comprendre vraiment ce qui s'est passé puis de prendre les mesures nécessaires à l'avenir pour que ça puisse ne pas se répéter.
Merci. En sous-question, alors j'aimerais savoir, vous semblez compter sur justement l'OACI pour s'assurer qu'il y ait de meilleurs mécanismes en place pour éviter de garder les espaces aériens ouverts en zone de conflit. Pouvez-vous m'en dire un peu plus à ce sujet?
Ce qu'on demande à l'OACI, c'est dans le cas d'accident, ou pas d'accident, mais de cas comme celui du PS 752, où ce qu'un avion est abattu par un pays, là, juste pour mettre en contexte, on a présentement un pays qui abat un avion, mais qui est permis ensuite d'enquêter sur cet événement-là. Fait que ça peut donner l'impression d'un conflit d'intérêts. En fait, ça peut être un conflit d'intérêts réel ou perçu. Mais un ou l'autre cause des problèmes au niveau de la crédibilité de l'enquête. Fait que c'est ça qu'on veut essayer d'améliorer avec l'OACI. On veut porter ça à l'attention de l'OACI parce que la crédibilité d'une enquête, c'est vraiment important pour que les gens ensuite prennent les messages qui sortent de cette enquête-là puis les appliquent pour, encore une fois, prévenir un accident semblable dans le futur.
Donc, j'avais peut-être mal compris. J'avais l'impression que ça concernait aussi le fait de maintenir les espaces aériens ouverts alors qu'il y avait des risques parce qu'il y avait justement une menace de conflit ou conflit en cours. Ça n'a rien à voir avec les conflits.
Ce que je pense que vous faites référence, c'est peut-être l'initiative de Sécurité de Transport Canada, l'initiative qu'on appelle pour des ciels plus sûrs. Ça, c'est une collaboration, en fait, entre plusieurs pays là, pour l'échange d'informations, justement, pour s'assurer que l'information qui est disponible à travers le monde sur les zones de conflit sont partagées rapidement à travers la communauté de l'aviation pour que les gens soient informés puis puissent prendre les bonnes décisions, faire leur évaluation de risque. Est-ce qu'on va voler là ou est-ce qu'on ne va pas voler là selon l'information qui est disponible? Présentement, cette information-là n'est pas toujours bien passée. Puis ça c'est ce que l'initiative de Transport Canada va essayer d'adresser. Une très bonne initiative.
Merci.
Operator, next question on the phone, please.
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press star 1 on the device's keypad if you have a question. N'hésitez pas à faire étoile 1 pour toute question sur votre appareil. There are no further questions on the telephone. Il n'y a plus de questions au téléphone. De retour à vous. Back to you.
This concludes the press conference. Thank you. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.